Well, hello, everybody. Good evening, and let's continue in reading through the book of Amos and going through and investigating this book. So today we're going to be basically in chapters 3 and a little bit of 4. A little bit shorter kind of text, at least, to cover, but still a lot of big stuff going on here. So if you remember last week, basically God lays out the case not only against Israel, but against some of the surrounding nations as well, including Judah, but kind of goes through this list of war crimes that the other nations have committed, and then really gets down and talks about Israel, and basically says judgment is coming upon them. So today we're going to get a little bit more into the content of that judgment, the why of that judgment, and the prophet making God's case before the people, and letting them know a little bit about what it's going to look like. So as we get into it, hopefully you've done your homework. You've read chapters 3 through 4 this week and read ahead. So hopefully you have some context for this, but we'll just jump right in. So the first issue that kind of comes up in chapter 3 is the issue of election for the people of Israel, in that they are talked to and judged here in this particular passage and in this particular oracle against them, not because they have done things like the other nations or they have sinned like the other nations. There is no doubt that they have, and they did. However, as we are talking and as we are getting into Israel in specific, God lays out how Israel was special among the nations. And this gets us into questions about what does election mean for the people of Israel. Oftentimes, election is taken as something that is privilege, right? We are elected to privilege. So this would take the case in that Israel would say, well, we're elected of God, which means that God protects us no matter what, that no matter what happens, God's on our side. No matter what happens, God is for us. We'll live in this land forever. We'll never be overthrown. And so has the overtones of being elected to privilege, whereas there's also this understanding of election, and probably more so for the people of God, is that it's not simply election to privilege, it is election to a particular way of being in the world, right? That their election has not just privileges, although it has privileges, but their election also has certain responsibilities that they have to do in response. That is, the nature of the covenant is this relationship that is not simply one-sided, not simply God saying everything you do is great, I'll love you, I'll always protect you for all time, and even when you do evil, I'll forgive it. There is some of that in God's speech to the people, but at some point, that election, the nature of who they are, God holds them accountable, even more so in some instances than other nations. And so that's really what's going on here. God talks about how, you alone of the nations have I known, of the families of the earth, right? Therefore, I will punish you for your iniquity. So what God brings out here for the people is not war crimes, although we'll get into that some of the stuff they've done is appalling even to the nations outside of Israel. But where God focuses and where Amos really drills down is this covenant relationship that has been broken by the iniquity or sin of the people of Israel. And so their election gives them privilege in many ways, but their election also comes with greater responsibility. Because of their election, they have greater responsibilities even than the nations around them. And they have abandoned their election by abandoning God, abandoning the terms of the covenant. They are special, but their election does not shield them from God's judgment. In fact, their election makes them almost more vulnerable to the judgment of God because of who God has called them to be in the world, which is unique, which is special among the nations in showing the nations God. And so we have that, and so then the prophet moves into kind of what we might call a cause and effect section. So, just kind of giving these kind of almost, I wouldn't call them proverbs, but they almost seem like that. But he asks sort of rhetorical questions, right? Do two people walk together without first agreeing to meet up and walk, right? To which anyone said, of course that. So this kind of cause and effect, like when this happens, or when you see this, we know that this has happened. And the prophet sort of uses that as a way of talking about what's going to occur, but also the prophetic task that he has, right? So he can draw this out in various different ways. One saying, like, when you're punished, the reason is because you have done something wrong, When God's judgment is coming against you, it is for a particular reason. Like it comes about as a natural consequence to other reasons. And so he's just kind of bringing this up there as kind of that prophetic way of when you answer easy questions and then the prophet asks a hard question, but that the answer is obvious and easy, it sort of traps the people into agreeing with the prophet's premise. But the prophet is talking about all of that in this nature of this is not unexpected. These are the effects of the causes that you're seeing. Do you not abandon the covenant and then have God come and hold you account? That kind of idea is at work here. So there's that kind of idea, but there's also the idea that that the prophet is actually giving his own sort of rationale for speaking to the people of Israel. That is to say, he is speaking because God has spoken to him first. Does not the prophet speak when God speaks? And so the prophet is giving these cause and effects so that to bring the people along, to show them the reasons for their judgment, but also to show them the reasons why he is there, right? The Lord has spoken to him, and the prophet, therefore, must speak as a result. He has no choice in the matter. And the people ought to respect that's what's going on. You know, and there's some language about the lion roaring, right? Does the lion roar when there is no prey, right? That kind of idea. So you know, again, he's almost saying, I'm roaring, or maybe the Lord's roaring. It's because something has happened. Something is going wrong. There is causes to these effects. It's not just nothing that's going on. These aren't just coincidences. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the next section as he begins to talk about these sort of things that have happened in Israel that the people have ignored, but that's God trying to get their attention. But they're not getting the cause and effect relationship of these things happening. A little bit in here is, and I put this on there because it brings up this sort of problem of evil that Amos, he brings up, and this happens in the biblical witness, this problem of evil that he talks about, does not evil befall a city and the Lord not cause it. So this very real kind of wrestling with the fact that when something bad happens, is God the cause of that? That's what is the traditional, the classic problem of evil, right? We can understand sometimes when people are hurt as natural consequences, but is God the source of these, what, again, Amos calls evil, right? And he brings that up and wrestles with that. The ancient understanding, if God is supreme and sovereign over all things, then God is the cause of all things, good and evil, or what we perceive perhaps as evil. And so Amos, his language brings up that question in us when we think about it, right? All these people are dying, some innocent. Is that really God's doing? Does that evil originate in God, or is that a natural consequence? What's going on here? Amos does not pause and help us with that. It's just important to bring it up, to acknowledge it, to know that there are no great answers in Scripture, because Scripture is kind of all over the map on God as cause of things. And 2,000 years of church history and many more years of biblical history have not been able to solve that. So I'm not going to be able to solve it for you today. Just acknowledging it's there and referencing it, and it should cause us to wrestle with those questions of, you know, is the hurricane caused by God, or is it a natural disaster? If God is the origin of all things, is that hurricane originating God? Do we call out that as God's judgment, or do we call that as sort of consequence of the world in which we live? It brings up all these questions that we have, can, and should wrestle with, but also knowing there are not real clear answers to them. And especially Amos does not provide clear answers to them, or his answers, that is, God is the source of these things, is disturbing to more modern sensibilities as we have. Again, is that bad or good? It just is. And we need to wrestle with that and talk about that, about what, when bad things happen, what is the source of that? Is God the source? Are we the source? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last thing I put on there, and we talked about this, is that really here Amos gives this impression and this idea that his task is not a choice on his part. That when the lion roars, the prophet must speak, so to speak. his task is not like, I wanted to come down and give you all an earful on behalf of God. It was God spoke. When God speaks, the prophet must also speak. And Amos will get in trouble. That some of the people will come to him and say, "Go prophesy in Judah. Leave here. Don't spread your prophecies around here. Go elsewhere and do that." But again, it's almost as Amos is preempting that and acknowledging that that's going to come up. People are going to accuse him of being a rabble-rouser, a malcontent, or all those things that we call prophets in the world. And he's just trying to say, I have to speak. I have no choice in this matter. And we will see that in various different ways of other prophets who basically, not because they want to, not because it's a glamorous lifestyle, but because they feel they must, because they have heard from God. And that's really kind of what's going on here in this particular section.
So with this idea of injustice and the fact that when there is injustice, God must act, that cause and effect. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, the question to be discussed in a small group or reflected upon, is it possible for us to accidentally commit an injustice or to kind of fall into being unjust in a way that God would have to respond in this way?
I'm going to give you a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is, I think, yes. The long answer is this. We are not people who are all-knowing. And so it is not always easy for us to know the consequences of our actions, or probably more to the point, it is hard to know the consequences of where we live, how we live, the cycles of our world, consumerism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And John Wesley talked about this as there's kind of two different types of sin in which humanity kind of takes place and takes part. Oversimplification, but there is kind of sort of individual sin or individual evil. That is when we make an individual choice to do something that is against a known law of God, right? So, no, Sheldon is late to work, so when he gets here and I go on my lunch, I hit his car. That would be individual evil, right? That is wrong on my part. I shouldn't do it. It was a sin, needs to be atoned for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? But we also are part of systems and of worlds that we did not create, but that we participate in knowingly and unknowingly. So much has been made about systemic racism in our country, right, over the last year and a half. And wherever you fall on that spectrum, the idea behind that is we who are not of color or who are white or who are the dominant race in this country, white for me, have systemic advantages over those who were in the past traditionally oppressed and whom are speaking up now and saying we still feel the effects of systemic racism in our country. And it's not that I set out to be a racist in this particular instance. It is that I am participating and have advantage because of my race over someone who is not the same color, whether it be they might be black or Asian or from anywhere else, right? That is what we would call systemic evil. And in as much as I choose to ignore that, I am participating in it. So when a person of color says, this is my experience of, marginalization, of racism, and I say, well, I didn't do it. I wasn't a slaveholder. My family came to the United States far after the 1860s, right? It is at that point that I begin to be aware of the problem and then consciously ignore it. So we could talk about it in that, like the racism is an issue, but we can talk about it in other things. So I have a cup of coffee. Well, it's empty now, but I had a cup of coffee up here. Coffee is one of those commodities that has exploited workers on the farm end, right? That powerful corporations, it is a Starbucks cup. I'm not blaming Starbucks for this, but powerful corporations have leverage to pay prices that are not fair or living wages to coffee growers, let's say in Guatemala. That's not where my coffee was from, but let's say that's where it is, right? So if I choose and continue in that, then I am participating in the systemic injustice that is going on there because I am benefiting from it by my relatively low-cost cup of coffee, okay? Chocolate is another big one. I hate to do this. The reason we hear about things like fair trade or certified organic or things like that is that there are groups who are saying we want to be as ethical as possible in the sourcing of things like chocolate or sugar or coffee, and saying we want to make sure that in as much as we can, we are not contributing to the systemic injustice or the subjugation of people economically or whatever, and we want to make sure that in as much as we can, we are paying a fair price for these things, a livable wage, so to speak. So that's how we participate in systemic injustice. Again, we have benefits perhaps of living in the country we do, of a large nuclear arsenal where we can dictate things that may not be just to other countries because of the size of our nuclear arsenal, or the size of our armies, right? We spend more on defense than any other country, and probably the next 8 countries combined, I think is the number, right? So we have advantages because of perhaps, and I couldn't cite something, but again, it's an example of perhaps unethical behaviors on the other end of that. So we have advantages that we enjoy. So how do we work against those things? That's an issue of the Spirit. How can we work for justice, even in as much as, we could move somewhere else, but there's systemic injustice everywhere. So our job is to work as much as we can in the ways we can for justice, not only right for me or for those in my immediate vicinity, but in even the practices of our nation or our country, wherever you happen to live. So this is why the church, this is why the African American church, at least, has been very, very vocal about racism issues. Their experience is systemic racism, and so they speak out. Dr. King, right, and even more now, right, saying this has not gone away, right? They're saying our experience is not equality or equity, for that matter, with the white church. Our experience is we are automatically regarded with suspicion, whereas others, white folks, may not be. Again, it is not to say blackness is inherently better than whiteness, or that whiteness is inherently evil. I don't want to say that. I don't think that's true. But it is to say that in this country, those folks, they're telling us that their experience is of racism, and that there is systemic injustice that they are working to dismantle, but that we are also, those of us who are not African American, are called to dismantle as well. 2 different ways of doing that, but that would be a good example, I guess. So, I hope that answers your question. Okay. All right, so we will move on to luxury and injustice, the next kind of section here. A sort of fascinating way to begin here is the first thing that Amos does in this section is call people to witness what God is doing and the issues that God is dealing with. And I think what is remarkable here is that the witnesses that the Lord assembles, right, that Amos is calling to, are foreign peoples. are outsiders, at least by sort of election definitions, right? God has said, you among the peoples I have known, and yet God calls the nations, the foreigners, those outside of kind of the covenant community of God, to be witnesses against Israel. And these are not just, nations. It's not like, Cush, come and witness. It is Egypt, where the people were enslaved for 400 years and who suffered because of their perpetration of injustice against Israel. So an enemy. And Ashdod is the other one, which was the capital of the Philistines. Philistines also a longtime foe of the people of Israel. Right? So these were the people who the people would cry out to God for protection against. And yet now they are called as witnesses against Israel, to witness the injustice that Israel perpetrates. They are witnesses to say, see, they are not doing right. They don't know how even to do right. And so it's again, I think it's one of those types of things where it would be like, I grew up kind of at the tail end of the Cold War, so this is what kind of is prominent in my mind, but the tail end of the Cold War, right, we have this sort of dichotomy, right, the evil communist empires versus the good and righteous democracy of the United States, right? So this would be somewhat akin to someone saying to us in the United States, right, Moscow, serve as a witness to the injustice in Washington, right? That's, I think, how it'd be received. Or today, in Tehran, right? Witness against the people of the United States. See how injustice is so rampant that God is going to do something about it, right? It's looking kind of at the people we regard as outsiders or even enemies, and God is asking them to be the witness, which is telling, I think, in that. It's also another way of looking and saying that the things in Israel are so bad that even the pagan nations who don't have the same covenant commitments to God can act as witnesses to how bad it is. They can even see how bad it is, right? They haven't been given the law, right? So not only should Israel know better, but even the nations who don't have Israel's covenant relationship with God know better than to do what they are doing. And that is it's a slap in the face. It's not pleasant for them to regard that. And so we have that, and then the prophet kind of moves on in verse 12 and talks about this. It's kind of a weird analogy for us to read, but if we think about it, I'm going to read it for you because it's strange, but it bears for us to understand. Thus says the Lord, as a shepherd rescues from the mouth of the lion 2 legs or a piece of an ear, so shall the people of Israel who live in Samaria be rescued with the corner of a couch or a part of a bed. Right? We will read that and go, huh? Presumably the people who are listening to would have understood this analogy. But what our best guess is that in the ancient world, if you were charged to watch over somebody's sheep, if you were a shepherd who was hired by someone else, and remember, Amos was a shepherd, so it seems appropriate that he would use this analogy. If the shepherd came to an owner and said, yeah, there was a sheep killed last night, right? A lion came and, ate Maisie or whatever. What the shepherd would be asked to do is produce like the remnant of that sheep that was eaten, right? Like 2 leg bones and an ear, right? See, it was killed. This is what's left over. You can clearly see it's been killed by a lion. 2 leg bones and an ear is not that much left of a sheep. And so God's talking about the nature of the destruction that's coming upon the people, right? This is going to happen, and it's going to be bad, and it's going to be extensive. It's not going to be minor or light. It's not to say, hey, see, look, some will be left over. It's to say there's not going to be much left. If you recall, you may recall Isaiah 6, right, where God tells Isaiah what he's going to prophesy, and he says, basically there's going to be a fire that sweeps through, and he says, if even a 10th part remains, I'm going to burn it again. Right? So this idea that God is saying that you will be reduced by 90%. And that's not very much if a 10th part remains, right? So we use the term decimated wrongly most of the time, but we talk about decimated. That means to be reduced by 10%, right? this is to be reduced by 90%, so only 10% remain. That kind of idea is going on there. So this may be hope for the people that there's a remnant left over, but it's not a very hopeful way of putting it, right? Don't worry, Sheldon, at the end of this month, you will have 10% of your paycheck left, right? That's not good news, right? If you go outside today, Mike, 10% of your car will be there. That's not good news, right? You'll have a wheel and an axle left. That's not good news. That's bad news. And so this isn't good news. This isn't say, oh, God will preserve a remnant. Like, it's not hope necessarily. It is saying things are going to be that bad. And then there's this language of punishment that God is going to testify against the house of Jacob. And then there's kind of this, there's the horns of the altar shall be cut off. This kind of strange language, but again, we have to go back to kind of the foundational covenants of Israel and God, in that the horns of the altar are this part of the altar where in the traditions, the sacrifice, the blood of atonement is smeared on the horns of the altar, right? And that is the symbol of atonement. And so if the horns of the altar are cut off, there is no place to make atonement for the people of God. What also might be at work there is that the cities that have been referenced in this chapter are sanctuary cities. Sanctuary cities where a person who commits a crime is able to go and find sanctuary. There's stuff in the Bible about people going to the temple and holding on to the horns of the altar, and that's where they find sanctuary from those who had come to kill them, come to seek justice, whatever. So kind of what's at stake here is that God's saying there is no atonement for this, and there's nowhere to seek refuge from what is coming. Right, at the horns of the altar, those places that are associated with refuge, with atonement, are gone. There's no place to flee or to hide or to way to escape this judgment. Again, it is final. It is sure, which again is one of the things that separates Amos from the other prophets. The other prophets later on get into the sort of return, that there's hope. But Amos, there's very little. There's no atonement. There's no hope. There's no turn and be healed in this moment, right? There's no hope for Israel at this point, at least as a nation. There may be a remnant left over, but it's a couple bones and an ear, right? It is not much. And then the Lord goes on to talk about, and Amos goes on to talk about again, about more of how this injustice is working, references what are the cows of Bashan, particularly calling women cows of Bashan. That insult then would not be equivalent to the insult now if we called a woman a cow. It's more of referencing, Bashan was a very fertile area, so talking about the people in that area. But what's really going on here is that the prophet is describing these women and the ways in which they perpetrate injustice. And it may sound strange, as if like, well, is it the women's fault? Well, no, it's not. I think what's going on here is there is no one who can claim immunity like I didn't know, or I'm, again, referencing the time, like I'm a woman in this household, I have no say over what my husband does, right? He did it, right? And that's very real at some times and places, right? Where especially in patriarchal countries, the man does something and the woman has to go along, right? And so there can be sort of ignorance claimed there. But I think what the prophet is doing is removing any claim of ignorance and saying, listen, when I'm talking about this, it is not just the men. Women are perpetrating injustice. They're feasting in their summer homes appointed with ivory, and they're sending their husbands or their lords to go get them wine, right? That they are just as culpable in the perpetration of injustice there, right? So this is a very sweeping judgment, not only on the men or the power brokers, but also on the women, that this is a total thing within the people of Israel. And so it's bad, right? It's not good. So I'm gonna stop there.
So real quick, I'm going to read verse 10 here. Okay. It says, "They do not know how to do right, declares the Lord, who store up in their fortresses what they have plundered and looted. So my question for you is, I guess, what do you make of Amos's seemingly, he's kind of linking injustice with greed, like they're storing this up. So I don't know, kind of reflect on and talk about what the link there means. Like, what do you make of this link between greed and injustice?
It's a good question. What is the link between amassing wealth and injustice? Certainly in the scriptures, in the prophetic scriptures, I mean, we see elsewhere where, greed is a sign of God's blessing, right? Especially with Genesis. In the patriarchs, not greed, I'm sorry, the acquisition of wealth is a sign of God's blessing, right? Abraham takes the less fertile land and does great, right? God blesses his flocks, his sheep, his herds, everything grows and grows and grows, right? The prophets, wealth is not spoken of as kind, as good thing, right? Wealth is significant of or signifies greed on behalf of those who are amassing it. And so I think we're to read that as that wealth is as the result of injustice, right? That the people are becoming wealthy, the haves, so to speak, are becoming wealthy on the backs of others. So if we kind of went back and about that kind of first oracle of judgment against Israel, it's talking about how you've sold your slaves, or you've sold them for wine, and sold people for bread, or sold children for bread, right? This idea that the people were even in some cases were selling others into slavery so that they could eat better, right? Were accusing people who were righteous of not paying back their debts and continuing to collect money from people who had already paid them back, right? That's injustice. So that I think the picture we get is that a people who are so far gone that they don't even realize it's wrong. Right? What happens when the conscience has been so seared as to say that not only are they unaware of the injustice, but rather they have no way of even seeing it. They have so systematically kind of gotten rid of any pang of conscience about these things. To flip that just a little bit, in the version that I study out of, the New Revised Standard, actually, verse 10 reads this way: "They do not know how to do right, says the Lord, those who store up violence and robbery in their strongholds." So it may be the same kind of thing, but this idea that what they are amassing, whether this money that they are amassing is simply just storing up the violence and robbery that they have committed, that it's not wealth, it is violence and robbery, right? And so it's almost as if to say that what the wealth that they have accumulated is actually testifying against them to the evil that they have done. They're just amassing testimony against them of injustice, of robbery, of violence, which is, again, an interesting way of talking about the amassing of wealth. I think it's going too far to say being wealthy is evil. I don't know that I would go. I don't think I would go that far. But certainly the greed as a result of injustice, or greed leads us to perpetrate injustice for the sake of our own amassing of wealth. And we do this on large scales, and we do this on personal small scales, right? I amass what I don't need, but when I amass what I don't need, am I taking something or denying something from someone who does? We had a toilet paper shortage in this country, which is a perfect example of that tendency that we have. Fear drives us to say, I won't have enough, and so we amass far more than we need so that those who ran out of toilet paper this morning can't go get it because I've got 1,800 rolls in my garage, right? That is that tendency of saying, amassing for me is more important than having enough or risking running low, but also in so doing ensuring that there is enough to go around. In the economy of God's kingdom, there is always enough to go around when we do not hoard, when we do not mass things for ourselves. But our tendency to greed, to wanting more than the next person, or wanting to make sure we have enough, whatever that is, or wanting the bigger house, the better car, whatever it might be, leads to either conscious exploitation of others, or more often, probably unconscious exploitation of others, or ignoring unconscious exploitation of others.
Just real quick to add on to that, I think I really like what you're saying there about how amassing wealth is not necessarily evil, but it's more so in what that leads to, right? So does getting a larger paycheck lead you to saving more for yourself, or does it lead you to giving more or being more open to those opportunities? That's something that I actually put a lot of thought into when we were moving here to Longview. We were looking at buying a house, and we have already invested a lot of money into a house, which easily could. I'm not saying that I'm wealthy by any means, but relatively, putting this money into a house, am I using that so that Kayla and I and our family can just turn inwards and build that up and enjoy our luxury living, or is it so that we can have people over and we can open our home to those who are in need? Just that understanding of what amassing wealth looks like and what it leads to.
Yeah. Well, and to just, right, we read about the early church, and there were people of means in the early church, right? As many who had houses and land sold them and laid it at the apostles' feet for the distribution of those who didn't have. Well, that presupposes that these people had the money in the first place. And nowhere does it say there's anything against them. And when Ananias and Sapphira go ahead and do their thing, they're struck dead, not because they withheld money, but because they lied about what they withheld. Right? That's the moral. The moral is don't lie. Be generous, or like it was theirs. It's yours to do with what you please, according to how God directs, but don't lie about it, right? So yeah, I don't know. And the church has been, right, supported many times by folks of means. So again, there's certain fields that if you're in those fields and you're good at it, you're going to make a lot of money, right? So the question is, what happens? How is that money used, right? What does Wesley say? Give all you can, or make all you can, right? I'm paraphrasing a paraphrase, but he basically says, make all you can and then give all you can away, right? Do all the good you can by all the means you can. But again, if you make money, use it and utilize it for the glory of God towards the purposes of God's kingdom, which oftentimes have to do with economics. But yeah, again, I don't want to sort of disparage richness per se, because I don't think there's any inherent evil in having money or making money. But certainly how we use it, and I don't want to say woe to the rich, because quite frankly, I might say, well, I'm not rich. I'm not rich by Jeff Bezos standards, right? But by world standards, I am very wealthy. So I say, just kind of putting this off on whoever we call the rich, I think is bad, because we can always justify how we're not rich. And so saying how we use our money is an important ethical issue. And we don't want to be guilty of amassing violence by our acquisition of things or of money. We want to be those who God has entrusted with much, and we have used that for the glory of God, God's kingdom, towards God's purposes. Yeah. It's an interesting and good question, and something the prophets often bring up. Money is a big deal for the prophets, and I think we ought to take that seriously. So the last section here is has to do with basically the prophet outlining things that have happened in Israel that should have led them and reminded them and shown them that there was course correction needed in their lives. So it's several things from like, I gave you cleanliness of teeth. To have clean teeth mean you didn't have food to eat, right? So I withheld food, right? You lack of bread, but you did not return to me. I withheld the rain, but you did not return to me, right? This idea of all these things that were happening that should have clued in the people that something was wrong, that something was needed, that they were not on proper relationship with Yahweh. But it didn't happen. It didn't cause them to come back. And so it's kind of this like, what plagues are you talking about, God? We don't know what you're talking about. And all that happens, I skipped a point there. All that happens as the people are glorying in and bragging about their right worship, right? We bring the right offerings at the right times and be proud of us for that. But the prophet puts it in, basically says, come to Bethel, which is a city where there was a high place where people worshiped, right? Come to Bethel and transgress. To Gilgal, again, another place where people would come and worship and multiply transgression. So basically, he's saying you're coming to bring worship, but your worship is sin. And in your worship, you are continuing it and multiplying your transgressions because your worship is indictment against you. It's shown as empty because your lives, the ethical responsibilities you have as the people of God, are not matching up to what is going on, to who you're called to be, and to the worship you are pretending to give to God. Crazy. Right? So in verse 5, right, bring thank offering of leavened bread and proclaim free will offerings. Publish them, for so you love to do. It's almost the same as saying, yeah, keep on doing it, but all you're doing is testifying against yourselves. And that's, I should have said that first, because that's when he goes into these plagues, right? You're doing all these things and thinking you're worshiping rightly, and yet these plagues are happening in your midst, and you are completely ignoring them, right? What plagues? What are you talking about? So there's several things going on. It's an indictment against the people. You should have known better, but it's an indictment against the people because God has given you opportunities to return, right? The plagues, again, when God does these things, 9.5 times out of 10 in scriptures, it's remedial, right? A plague is meant to effect a particular response from the people, not simply to punish them. So even the plagues of Egypt, right? The people ask, release us to go into the wilderness to worship our God. Pharaoh says, okay, and then backtracks that promise, and God gives them a plague. And then he says, no, I'll do it. And then as soon as the plague's gone, Pharaoh backtracks, says, no, you can't worship your God. Right? So it's meant to get the attention of the Pharaoh to do things, to change, to allow the people to go, and yet the Pharaoh does not. So in the same way, these plagues are brought upon the people of Israel in order to get them to turn, to repent, to see that something is needed, and nothing happens. And so as a result, this last phrase is basically, prepare to meet your God. I mean, we're familiar enough with this kind of language that if someone says, prepare to meet your maker, we know that is not like, oh yeah, I get to go see God, right? That's not what they're intending to say by that phrase, and that's not what Amos is intending to say by that phrase. There are two reasons to meet with God where this kind of language is employed in the Old Testament. One is within the terms of a covenant-making relationship, right? So the people are gathered at Sinai, and basically they're made holy. They're told to sanctify themselves because you're going to meet with God, right? That's a good thing. And the other is when God comes in judgment, right? You're going to meet your God, and it's going to be in judgment. God tried to get your attention, you ignored. God is coming. Prepare to meet Yahweh, right? For the righteous, prepare to meet Yahweh is maybe an awesome thing and a thing that invokes the fear of God in general, which is good. We ought to have an awe and reverence of God, but it's a good thing. But for those who are acting in injustice and unrighteousness, again, in the context of all Amos has said this far, prepare to meet your God is dangerous and judgment, and not a good thing. And so basically the statement is Yahweh's coming, right? Yahweh is not simply a God of a regional deity, not simply confined to this area, but Yahweh, the creator of all that is, God of the earth, is coming to meet you and is coming in your midst. And because of all the stuff that's come before, this is not a happy meeting, right? When things are going good at the business and the manager comes in, right, that's a happy meeting. When things are going bad and the boss comes in, that's not, I mean, we don't generally assume that's a happy meeting, right? And Amos has really established that this is not going to be a happy meeting. You are going to meet God. It's too late to forestall the judgment that is coming. Yahweh is coming. There is nothing you can do about it at this point. You have not turned. In fact, you are incapable of recognizing the depths of your sin. And you are incapable not because you are blissfully ignorant, but because you are wantonly rebellious. And that's the message that we are getting thus far.
I find it very interesting that I don't know if it's each verse, but each stanza at least kind of has this same, yet you have not returned to me. And I think in a lot of ways, if we kind of put ourselves in the context of what Amos is writing and who he's writing it to, it can be kind of like, you foolish, evil people, why haven't you wisened up yet? But I think in our context, reading it today and kind of reading it in the historical understanding, I don't know, maybe this is a poor way of interpreting it, but I think there's some hope there, of the fact that, boy, God gives a lot of chances even to people who have done the worst. That he gives a lot of warning, and there's a lot of it comes across in different ways, but there's a lot of calling back that he does, no matter how far you have gone from him. And so again, maybe that's just my optimistic way of looking at things that's coming through, but I guess I don't really have a question with that, but just something to think about, that even in this warning of God's judgment and this warning of what God will do to them because they have not repented, I think there's at least a glimmer of hope there that, like, oh yeah, God does offer us lots of opportunities to repent.
So I think there's some interesting stuff at play there. I don't read it so hopefully. Like, that didn't occur to me. It's good. I like it, but it didn't occur to me as I was reading this. As you were talking about that, I sort of like, sometimes it feels like you're watching a horror movie, right? We know what's around the corner, right? Why do they always open the door? Why do they always run to the garage full of chainsaws? Yeah, like what, we look at this like, why do they do that? Obviously, looking at it from this perspective, we can say, well, they ignored and woe is them. But part of me says, yes, God gives us, coming along with you, God gives us chances. God tries to warn us in various different ways, whether it be through the scriptures or through other people, through prophetic voices, right? So I like that God is giving us chances. We just have to be willing to hear, right? One of the things that a refrain in the book of Revelation, for those who have ears, let them hear. For those who are willing to listen to what the Lord is saying to the churches, and outlines this to these 7 churches, and we go, oh, okay, I can see how I might get into the lukewarmness of Laodicea, or I might go after these other things like whoever, right? And so it helps us to pay attention. And that's, I think, partially what this does is for those who are reading on the other side of this, I mean, if there's no hope for Israel, well, wait, then there's hope for us because we have it. So what are the signs we're ignoring? Right? In some places, right, Jesus will say to the Jews, you had the prophets and you did not listen. So who are the prophets that we're not listening to? I think we don't listen to Amos when he says, let justice roll like waters. And again, this had been on my mind this last year, but are we listening to Dr. King, who quoted that text in his I Have a Dream speech? Right? His dream is that there is this time of justice where the wrongs that a country he loved had perpetrated in the past would be made right. Right? Let justice roll like waters. So he's calling the church, calling the nation in that case, but calling the church to account for that. We have voices in our own time who are calling the church to account for racial things, but also other things. And the question is, are we going to, right? There was injustice in your midst, and you did not return to me. Dr. King said this to you, and yet you did not listen. Right? I think we need to be willing to listen to those voices, right? There was wonderful things about Dr. King. There are some things we don't like, but right? There were some questionable moral decisions he made, but for goodness sake, the call to justice is right and is good. Are we listening? Are we really listening to that? Yeah, I mean, I will say the plight of the immigrants is something. Are we really listening to that? Are we listening to the prophets and what they say about the foreigner in our land? Are we listening to that? It's one thing to say, I have listened and this is how I think is best, and I might disagree with you on that, but at least we're listening. And we're trying to work through it together and saying, what do we respond? How do we respond as a people of God to this? These are justice issues. Race is a justice issue. And I'm sorry if there are voices out there saying that if your church preaches about justice, leave, because the Old Testament is about justice in very, very large parts of it. The New Testament talks about this. James, read James, right? We have to be about godly concepts of justice. Does it look differently than the people around us, in the world around us, than even our nation? At times, yes. But we as the church need to be about godly forms of justice because the prophets cared about it. And if the prophets cared about it, we need to listen. We have it in our canon. We can't say, well, we can have the wonderful victory, God, without listening to this God who demands justice from God's people. Soapbox. I will get down from that soapbox at this particular point. But I would venture to say, Sheldon said, he just told me he'd add a question in, but I'll ask you a question too as you go out from this. What are the prophetic voices or the situations in our world that we need to be listening to remind us to return to the Lord? Not just in our hearts, right, of fidelity to God, but also in our actions, right? Return to God for the people of Israel wasn't like just start worshiping me again, because they were worshiping Yahweh. Wrongly, I mean, empty, but they were worshiping. They were doing the right things to worship Yahweh. So it's not just about right worship, right? About making sure we're in church and singing the right songs and reading the Bible. Those are all very important things. But the call to return to the Lord was also a call to do the things that the Lord requires, in which case that would be, among the many things, justice, not perpetrating injustice. So what are the prophetic voices calling us to? What are the situations in our world, right? We can go, let's dismiss Black Lives Matter because, I don't know, whatever might be associated with it. Or we can say, there's something that is calling us to account to justice, and we need to listen. How we respond is up for debate, but we need to listen. And we need to respond in godly ways. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sheldon for music. Again, next week, read the next few chapters in Amos. But other than that, have a wonderful evening, and God bless.
We've waited for this day. We're gathered in your name, calling out to you. Your glory like a fire, awakening desire, will burn our hearts with truth. You're the reason we're here. You're the reason we're singing. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart, filling every part of our praise. Your presence in this place, your glory on our face, we're looking to the sky. Descending like a cloud, you're standing with us now. Lord, unveil our eyes. You're the reason we're here. You're the reason we're singing. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart, filling every part of our praise. Show us your glory. Show us your power. Show us your glory, Lord. Show us your glory. Show us your power. Show us your glory, Lord. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart, filling every part of our praise. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart, filling every part of our praise. Flowing from your heart, filling every part of our praise.
I wonder if I'll ever find my way. I wonder if my life could really change at all. All this earth, could all that is lost ever be found? Could a garden come up from this ground at all? You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of the dust. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of us. All around, hope is springing up from this old ground. Out of chaos, life is being found in you. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of dust. You make
out of the dust. You make me new. You are making me new. You make me new. You are making me new. You make me new. You are making me new. You make me new. You are making me new. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of dust. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of us. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of the dust. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of us. Father of kindness, you have poured out grace. You brought me out of darkness, you have filled me with peace. Giver of mercy, you're my help in time of need. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Beautiful Savior, you have brought me near. You pulled me from the ashes, you have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but see. Faithful you are. Faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are. Faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your
promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen.
Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes